Still alone? That's almost embarrassing.
CEO brought his mistress to the gala, then froze as his ex-wife kissed a billionaire hook dialogue. "I've been patient for 18 months, Elliot. Tonight is just the announcement." Pre-story summary. When Nora Caldwell walked into the Hargrove Capital Charity Gala on another man's arm, she wasn't there to make her ex-husband jealous. She was there to collect what had always been hers. Daniel Hargrove had spent 2 years believing he'd ended a cold, broken marriage on his own terms, but what he didn't know was that his chief operating officer had handed him a carefully constructed lie, and Nora had spent the 18 months since she found out building a response. This is the story of a woman who chose patience over confrontation, and what happens when that patience finally has somewhere to go. There's a boardroom, a recorded threat, a vote that changes everything, and 2 people who spent 2 years being strangers to each other, finally learning what it would have cost them to just tell the truth. Chapter 1. The night she announced herself. The Hargrove Capital Annual Charity Gala occupied the entire 3rd floor of the Whitmore Hotel on Park Avenue, which was a building that had been expensive in 1924 and had spent the century since becoming stratospherically more so. The ballroom ceiling reached 30 feet into gilded plasterwork, and the chandeliers alone cost more to insure than most people's first homes, and the Italian marble floor held a coldness that had made every woman present quietly miserable since cocktail hour, and that none of them would have mentioned under any circumstances. 300 guests moved through the space with the calibrated ease of people who had been attending events like this since before they knew what they were, who had long ago replaced genuine enjoyment with social efficiency, and who could read the entire composition of a room, who was up, who was down, who was being watched, and why, in the time it took to cross it. Daniel Hargrove arrived at 8:15 with Simone Archer on his arm. He was 42, 6'2", with the kind of face that reads as certainty in photographs and reads as something more complicated in person, the face of a man in the habit of being right, which in Daniel's case was not entirely inaccurate, and which had been reinforced over 2 decades by outcomes that confirmed it. He wore charcoal and no pocket square, which in Daniel's case was always deliberately the latter disguised as the former. He had spent 20 years attending events like this one, and had the specific ease of a man who had stopped needing to prove things to rooms like this approximately 12 years ago, which meant he moved without urgency, shook hands with genuine rather than performed attention, and had developed a way of entering a space that made the space quietly reconfigure itself around him. Simone Archer was 36, a venture partner at a firm 2 blocks from Hargrove Capital, and she wore a gown in deep black that managed to look like no other black gown in the room without appearing to try. She had copper-streaked hair she wore loose, and a specific kind of confidence that came not from certainty about outcomes, but from certainty about herself, which is rarer and more durable. 14 months with Daniel had taught her a great deal about the architecture of his professional self, and somewhat less about what existed in the spaces between those functions. She had formed the working theory, somewhere around the 7th month, that this gap was not the result of limited access. She had very good access, but was structural. One of the load-bearing walls of how Daniel Hargrove was put together. She smiled at the city councilman Daniel introduced her to. She said something specific and correct about the hospital foundation's endowment, and something warmer about the councilman's recent transit initiative, and held her champagne glass with the ease of someone who had learned to be comfortable in every room. All the while she was conducting the separate, largely unconscious project she was always conducting, watching, storing, not yet drawing conclusions. Marcus Webb found them at the back bar at 8:43. He was 50, compact, silver-haired, with the manner of a man who had spent decades being the most prepared person in any room and who had mastered the discipline of allowing others to feel more important than him right up to the moment where that illusion became inconvenient. He had been Daniel's COO for 7 years and knew Hargrove Capital the way a surgeon knows a body, not just the organs, but the pathways and the dependencies and the places where one wrong cut changes everything downstream. He shook Daniel's hand briefly and with both of his, as close allies do, and said something low enough that Simone caught the tone but not the words, and Daniel's jaw tightened for 1/2 of 1 second before it relaxed. "You look like you're having a good time," Marcus said, which in his vocabulary meant the opposite. "I always have a good time," Daniel said. Marcus smiled in the way of someone who has completed a private calculation and moved forward. At 9 o'clock exactly, the atmosphere of the room changed, not in sound but in quality, the particular shift when 300 people look up or want to look up, or deliberately do not look up, but make the choice with the full awareness that there is something to look at. Simone felt it before she identified it, a slight concentration of attention moving toward the main entrance, and she turned. Nora Caldwell walked 4 steps into the room and stopped, just far enough inside to be visible from every angle, not far enough to appear to have planned this, which meant she had planned it with great care. She wore a gown the color of deep burgundy wine, and her dark hair was swept back from a face that had always been striking and had become, in the 2 years since Daniel last stood in the same room with her, something closer to formidable, the specific quality of a face that has lived through something difficult and emerged not softer but cleaner, the unnecessary parts stripped away. She had the relaxed, grounded stillness of someone who had decided, before entering, precisely what she was going to do and was doing it. Elliot Vance was beside her, silver-haired, 47, with the quiet authority of a man whose money was old enough that he'd stopped thinking about it, which paradoxically made everyone else think about it constantly. His hand was at the small of Nora's back, with a familiarity that could have been intimacy or could have been something else entirely, and from 40 feet away and 2 years of distance, Daniel had no equipment to determine which. Elliot turned toward Nora, said something near her ear, and kissed her. Not a peck, a real kiss, brief, deliberate, completely aware of the room. Daniel Hargrove went still. The glass of scotch stopped moving toward his mouth and remained suspended in the air for 4 full seconds, while the system of composed narratives that had been running quietly in his chest for 2 years, the right decision, the marriage was already over. I'm fine. Received data it didn't have a category for, and paused all other functions while it tried to find one. Don't, Marcus said, from directly at his elbow. He had prepared that single word. The preparation was audible in the evenness of it. Don't what? Daniel said. Whatever you're about to decide to do right now, I'm not deciding anything. Good. The Meridian partners are looking for you. Daniel lowered the glass. He went with Marcus. He did not look in Nora's direction for the next 40 minutes, which was its own form of looking. Simone, standing 3 feet away, had watched all of this with the calm, unhurried attention of a person who has learned that the most useful information is almost always in what people are trying not to do. 4 seconds, the glass. Marcus's voice, too controlled for a man who had nothing to prepare for. She filed all of it away and returned to her champagne and her conversation with the councilman, and she did not bring any of it out again until she was ready to look at it properly. Daniel worked the room with the fluent professionalism of a man who had been navigating high-stakes social events for 20 years. He was warm with the people he respected, correctly attentive with the ones he needed, manage the whole performance without appearing to manage anything, and the entire time, wherever he happened to be standing, his awareness of where Nora was positioned in the room remained as constant and involuntary as a compass responding to north. The transition from cocktails to dinner brought the two groups into proximity near the center of the ballroom, one of those geometric inevitabilities that Marcus had positioned as a controlled encounter, and that he would spend the following week wishing he had instead prevented entirely. Nora saw them coming. She did not step toward them, and she did not step away. She stood with the patient, grounded attention of someone who has expected this and has already decided what she will and will not do with it. "Nora," Daniel said. "Daniel." A pause the length of a breath. "You look well." She said it as simple fact, not warmth. He did look well, the composed, rested face of a man who had decided he was fine and had imposed that decision on his nervous system through discipline and routine. "This is Elliot," she said, not needing to add a surname in a room like this, and Elliot extended his hand and Daniel shook it, and the two men conducted the specific, civilized transaction of a handshake that is actually a measurement. "Solid portfolio," Elliot said, "particularly the infrastructure work." "Thank you," Daniel said, and was immediately aware the response didn't quite fit the sentence, but Elliot absorbed it gracefully, and Marcus stepped in with something about the hotel renovation fund, and the conversation moved sideways in the way of conversations being managed. And then Nora looked at Daniel, not with emotion, not with performance, with the clear directness of someone who has one specific thing to say and is saying it. 18 months teaches you a great deal about patience," she said, "about knowing what's actually worth waiting for." She said it only to him. She held his gaze for exactly as long as it took to make sure the sentence had arrived, and then she turned back to her group, and Marcus's hand appeared on Daniel's shoulder, steering him toward the dining room, and Daniel went, because what was the alternative? Dinner moved through its courses. The salmon was excellent. The speeches were appropriately brief. Daniel said the right things to the right people, and laughed in the right places, and was present in the way that skilled, controlled people are present when a significant portion of their processing is occupied somewhere they can't name. Simone sat beside him and was genuinely warm with the person on her right, and ate her food with the pleasant composure that was characteristic of her, regardless of conditions. Once, during the salad course, she became aware of a slight directional shift in Daniel's attention, not dramatic, just the lean of a person orienting toward a sound, and she turned naturally and followed it to where Nora sat 3 tables away, leaning toward Elliot with a small private smile, and Elliot said something with his head close to hers. Simone looked at this for a moment. She set her fork down. She picked it up again. At 10:43, a small, precise woman in a charcoal blazer appeared at Nora's shoulder during dessert and said 4 words into her ear. Whatever the 4 words were, they produced in Nora's face a response visible only to someone watching for it, a deepening of stillness, the particular quality of someone who has been walking toward a place for a very long time and has just found it there, exactly where she expected. Nora touched the woman's hand once. The woman dissolved back into the room. The gala came apart around 11:30. Cars were called. Plans were made with the vagueness of people who will not follow through on them. Daniel turned a corner near the cloakroom and found himself face to face with Nora, both of them heading for the same exit, both stopping at the same moment. The corridor was quiet, the party sounds muffled behind them, 2 feet between them, which was both too much and not enough. She looked at him with the clear, impersonal gaze of someone who has completed her internal work and arrived cleanly on the other side of it. "Good night, Daniel," she said. "Nora, I'll see you soon." She said it with the precision of a confirmed appointment, not a social pleasantry. not a threat. A date on a calendar she had already reviewed. Then she turned and walked away, her heels quiet on the marble floor, and Daniel stood in that corridor for 30 seconds after she rounded the corner, not moving. Simone did not share his car. Early call, she said. The San Francisco team, he said, of course, and kissed her cheek and watched her walk toward the cab line. She stood on the sidewalk after his car left, alone in the cold Manhattan air, and she thought about the 4 seconds and the glass, and the way Daniel's body had oriented itself in the ballroom all evening like a man who couldn't quite stop listening for a sound. She thought, I have watched Daniel Hargrove in high-stakes situations for 14 months. I know the difference between his face when he is managing something and his face when something breaks through the management. She thought, without anger, as a woman, reading an accurate measurement, I have never, not once in 14 months, made his face do what it did for those 4 seconds when Nora Caldwell walked through that entrance. She got into a cab going uptown. She was not, she found, particularly sad. She was something more useful. She was clear, and clarity, she knew from long experience, was where everything real begins. Chapter 2. What he told himself, and what she never did. The days after the gala had a specific texture in Daniel's office. He arrived earlier than necessary, worked with a driven, unfocused energy that his assistant had learned over years to interpret as a sign that something was wrong and that it was not her business to address, and made decisions he had been avoiding for weeks with a brusqueness that got things done without making anyone feel good about it. His output was high. His attention was somewhere else entirely. These two facts had coexisted in his professional life before, during the periods when something was working in him that he hadn't given a name, and his staff recognized the pattern and gave him space. Marcus left 2 voicemails in the first 48 hours. Daniel let both go. He listened to the second one late on a Monday afternoon, standing at his window with the city below him. Marcus's voice was measured and unhurried, the specific voice of a man who had not lost sleep and wanted you to know it. She was performing, Marcus said. That's all Saturday was. You know how she gets when she wants to make a point. Don't overthink this. Daniel deleted the voicemail and did not call back, which was notable, because in 7 years Daniel had almost never not called Marcus back. On Tuesday evening, he went to Simone's apartment in the West 70s, which was a clean, book-filled space that smelled like coffee and some kind of white flower he'd never identified. And they sat on her couch with wine, and she told him about the San Francisco deal, and he listened well enough to ask the right follow-up questions. The follow-up questions were an effort. She knew this. She was very good at the distinction between natural attention and performed attention. An hour in, she set her wine glass down with deliberate care and turned to look at him directly. I want to say something, she said. I'd like you to hear all of it before you respond. Okay, he said. I've been thinking about Saturday since it happened. Not about Nora as a person. I don't know her. About you. Specifically about your face for 4 or 5 seconds when she walked through the entrance. She kept her voice even, not cold, just honest in the particular way Simone was honest, without hedging, without apology, without cruelty. You have extremely good control of your expressions. I've watched you in rooms a lot more stressful than a charity gala, and whatever happened in those 4 seconds wasn't control. It was something breaking through the control. Simone, I'm not done. She wasn't unkind about the interruption. I'm not angry, and I'm not accusing you of anything dishonest. I'm telling you what I saw, because I think you deserve someone who does that, and I think maybe that's been rarer in your life than it should have been. A brief pause. I think you loved her. I think some version of that is still in you, and I think you've been with me for 14 months, in a way that was real and decent and sometimes genuinely good, but that was also, some portion of the time, about not being alone with that. She held his eyes. I'm not your substitute for something that ended badly. I'm a person who deserves to be the actual thing, not the stand-in. Daniel was quiet. He looked at the coffee table. I don't know what I feel about her, he said finally. I genuinely don't. I know you don't, she said. That's part of what I'm telling you. She picked her wine back up. I'm not asking you to figure it out tonight. I'm saying I see it, and I'd like us both to be honest about what that means. He left at 9. She stood at the window and watched his car disappear into traffic and felt, alongside the genuine sadness of it, an unexpected relief, the relief of having put the true thing in the room where it belonged. In the car going downtown, Daniel thought about what Simone had said and found he couldn't argue with much of it. He turned, as he did with things he didn't want to look at directly, to the specific, not the whole of the marriage, but individual scenes, the ones that had remained most clearly defined in his memory. He thought about the Thursday Marcus had come to his office. It had been near the end of a long day, 2.5 years ago, and Marcus had come in with the look of a man who had braced himself to deliver something, not visible distress. Marcus never showed distress, but a slight overall tightening, the careful bearing of someone executing a rehearsed entrance. He had set a printed email on Daniel's desk without preamble and said there had been an IT audit of the shared calendar server. And this had surfaced in the archived threads, and he thought Daniel should know. The email was from Nora's account, addressed to her college roommate Diane in Chicago, written 14 months into their marriage. Daniel had read it 3 times before his brain processed what his eyes were showing him. Functional, but not what I thought this would feel like, she had written. And then, the sense that had sat in his chest ever since. Some days, I think I'm only still in it. Because leaving seems like too much work. He had looked at that sentence for a long time. Then Marcus placed a photograph next to the email at a small restaurant table, leaning across toward a man Daniel knew slightly from a property development conference the previous year. The angle of the shot made the lean look like more than it might have been. A still photograph cannot qualify or contextualize, and Daniel had not been in a position to ask it to. Photographer's assistant sent it over, Marcus said. They were clearing files. Wasn't sure if it was supposed to be private. Daniel had asked Marcus to leave his office. What he had not done in the hours that followed was ask a single question about the email. He had not asked why an IT audit of a calendar server would surface personal correspondence. He had not asked about the chain of custody of the photograph or why Marcus was the one receiving it from a photographer's assistant. He had not asked whether I'm only still in it, because leaving seems like too much work was the declaration of a woman who had stopped caring, or the raw, late-night exhaustion of a woman who was trying very hard at something very hard. He had not asked because asking would have required him to question the story, and the story had arrived at exactly the moment when it was most convenient to receive it, when the half shape of something he had already half believed was waiting to be confirmed. The coldness he had perceived in Nora, the way she processed things internally before bringing them out, the silences he had read as indifference instead of the particular silence of a woman who had learned to carry things alone. He had constructed a narrative out of those silences, and Marcus had handed him a document that confirmed what he had already, quietly, decided to believe. The alternative was worse. The alternative was you misread her. You were in a marriage for 3 years, and you were so busy being certain about what you thought you saw that you never looked carefully enough to see what was actually there. He sat in the parking garage under his building for 5 minutes after the car stopped. The 5 minutes were not comfortable. and they were not supposed to be. In another part of the city, 2 years and 3 days earlier, Nora Caldwell had sat in a rented 14th floor office in Midtown on a Monday morning, 3 days after the divorce was finalized, alone in a space she had leased under her maiden name, Nora Spencer. The carpet was beige. There was a north-facing window, a desk she had brought herself, a lamp, and a coffee maker she had purchased 2 days earlier, along with the specific brand of coffee she liked, which was the small private comfort you allow yourself when the larger comforts are temporarily out of reach. She had a legal pad on the desk and a pen, and she had not yet written anything on it. She sat with the north-facing window for a while. The city outside was gray and moving and entirely indifferent to what was happening to her, which she found unexpectedly useful. It didn't need her to be okay. It simply continued its business, which meant she could continue hers. Carol Huang had called at 7:40 that morning with the preliminary forensic findings. The metadata on the email Marcus had given Daniel showed inconsistencies with the server activity logs. The modification timestamps didn't align with normal usage patterns. The file had been accessed by a device logged in under an admin account that Nora had never used. The email address is real, Carol had said. The routing data is not. Someone with admin-level access made changes to the original file. A pause. We don't move on this yet. We move when we have a room to move in. Nora set the phone down and looked at the legal pad. She was not, in this moment, crying. She had allowed herself the 2 days between learning what Marcus had done and making the appointment with Carol, 2 full days in her apartment, without management or construction, just the grief and the anger and something darker than anger that she didn't have a clean name for. She had let those 2 days be exactly what they were. Then, on the 3rd morning, she had made the coffee and gotten dressed and leased this office and come in. She thought about her father. He had built a company over 20 years and lost it in 14 months because he trusted the wrong partner and, at the moment it mattered most, did not have the skills to stop what was happening. She had watched that process from close range. She had been 23 when it started and 25 when it finished, and she had made in those 2 years a set of decisions about who she was going to be and what she was going to learn and what she was never going to let happen to herself. Those decisions had held. She had been keeping them ever since. She picked up the pen. She wrote at the top of the legal pad what was done and what I can do about it. Then, below it, begin with the shares. Marcus Webb found the anomaly in the SEC filings on a Thursday morning 12 days after the gala. His assistant flagged a holding company called Sunrise Bridge Holdings LLC that had been acquiring Hargrove Capital equity in quarterly increments over the previous 8 months. The filing was routine in every visible way. The Delaware registered structure was unremarkable, but the attorney of record on one of the subsidiary documents was a name Marcus recognized, Carol Huang, who had appeared on behalf of Nora Spencer in the divorce proceedings. Marcus sat with this for a long time. His office was quiet. Outside, Park Avenue moved in its ordinary morning traffic. He considered what it meant that Nora had been acquiring shares under a name he wasn't watching, and he considered the gala, the confidence of her entrance, the calculation of the kiss, the precise quality of "I'll see you soon" that he had heard from 12 feet away, and he began to understand that what he had assumed was a bitter ex-wife making a public point was something considerably more organized. He called his outside attorney at 11:20. He did not call Daniel. Chapter 3. The architecture of what she built. Elliot Vance's New York office occupied the top 2 floors of a Tribeca building he had purchased in 2019 and renovated so completely that it retained nothing of its original industrial character except the bones, which were excellent. The space was warm and specific. Good art, actual books, a kitchen that smelled like real food rather than the performative wellness pantries that had become standard in firms like his. Nora had discovered over 18 months of working closely with him, a person who was genuinely interested in the world and who had enough money that he didn't need to perform interest in anything, which made his actual interests more legible than most. He was waiting when she arrived at 10 on a Wednesday morning, 2 weeks after the gala. He poured her coffee without asking, because he knew how she took it, and because this was the 72nd meeting they had held in this office in the past 18 months, which meant the small rituals were settled. They went through the documents Carol had sent, the share transfer confirmations, the board composition analysis, the legal correspondence from Marcus's outside firm, and talked through the timeline. The timeline held. It had always held. Nora built timelines the way her father had built companies, before the wrong partner, with the understanding that the plan is not the point. The plan is the container for the point, and the point is knowing exactly what you're doing when the container cracks. You could take the money and go to Portugal, Elliot said. He said it the way he had said it before, not as advice, not even really as a suggestion, but as the kind of thing a person says to test whether what they think they know about someone is still accurate. I know, Nora said. There's a version of this where you sell the shares at current market value, which is not nothing, and Carol puts together a civil settlement, and you never have to sit in a room with Marcus Webb again. I know that too. She looked at him across the coffee cups. Is that what you think I should do? Elliot considered it in the specific way he considered things, not rushing to fill the silence, genuinely thinking it through. I think what you're doing is harder and more expensive and will cost you more than you're letting yourself imagine right now. He paused. And I think it's the right thing. I think you know that. I'm not doing it because it's right, she said. I'm doing it because it's real. Because the alternative is letting him believe the story Marcus told forever, and I can't. She stopped for a moment. She looked down at the table. My father lost his company because he trusted the wrong person and didn't have the tools to stop what was happening. I have the tools. I've spent my entire adult life building the tools, and I'm going to use them. Elliot nodded. The particular quality of his silence was one of the things she had come to rely on in him. Not agreement, not sympathy, but recognition. The recognition of someone who understands what you're saying and doesn't need it softened. She was not in love with Elliot Vance. He was not in love with her. This was something they had established clearly, somewhere around the 4th month of working together, without drama and without lingering awkwardness, because they were both people who knew the difference between genuine regard and romantic feeling, and they had the former in abundance, and the latter not at all. The kiss at the gala had been Nora's idea, executed with Elliot's full cooperation and a shared understanding of exactly where Daniel would be standing when it happened. The week before the event, going over the logistics, she had asked, "Is this going to bother you, professionally or personally?" He had said, "Nora, I've done harder things than kiss a woman I respect in front of a man who needs to think carefully about his next move. I'll manage." The legal counter, moves from Marcus's side, began arriving 10 days after the gala, delivered through an outside firm that was expensive and experienced and designed to create friction rather than succeed. 3 chain of title challenges on the share acquisitions. Procedural motions requesting documentation that would take time and resources to produce. The strategy of a man who understood he couldn't win the war of facts and had decided to win the war of attrition instead. Carol neutralized each one with methodical, undramatic precision, the way she had been neutralizing things for 25 years. She was not remotely impressed. Daniel showed up at Nora's apartment on a Thursday afternoon without calling first. She lived in the Upper West Side co-op. She had kept in the divorce settlement, something Marcus had assumed she would sell, and that she had instead renewed the maintenance on the day the papers were signed, with the quiet intention of a woman who does not abandon her foundation when someone tells her she's lost. She told the doorman to send Daniel up, set her coffee on the counter, and stood in the middle of her living room and waited. He looked tired in a way she hadn't seen at the gala, where everything had been performance. Here, without the ballroom and 300 witnesses, he was just a man who hadn't been sleeping well, and who was carrying something in his face that she recognized from the years when she had known every expression. He had the look of a man who has arrived at the edge of a thing he doesn't want to be true and cannot any longer avoid it. "Come in," she said. He came in with his coat still on and stood in her living room looking at the space, the books on their shelves, the art she had chosen herself, the photographs on the mantle of her father and her college friends, and a trip she had taken to Portugal 2 years ago on the first long weekend after she understood what she was going to do. She watched him take it in, this life she had built without him, and she felt something that was not satisfaction and not grief, but was adjacent to both, the recognition of how much had been taken and how much had been made anyway. "You look well," he said, and then, "I'm sorry. You said that to me Saturday. I don't know why I said it." "It's fine," she said. "Sit down if you want." He didn't sit. He stood in the middle of her living room with his coat on and said, "What did you mean? The 18 months? She looked at him. "I meant exactly what I said. Patience, knowing what's worth waiting for. Nora." His voice was careful, feeling its way. "The things I was told when the marriage, toward the end, the things I believed. I've been." "What things?" she said. He said, very carefully, "The email. Marcus showed me an email." She looked at him with an expression that was completely flat and completely still, and that said, with precise economy, everything she was not going to say out loud in this conversation. She let the silence do its work. Then she said, "Ask Marcus to show you the original, not the PDF he printed for you, the actual file, pulled from your own server archive, with the complete routing metadata." He stared at her. "Why?" "Because the answer to the questions you're trying to ask me is in that document, and I'd like you to get there on your own." A pause. "What about the photograph?" "Ask the photographer," she said. "Not the assistant, the photographer directly." She said this once and did not repeat it. He stood in her living room for another moment, holding this, and she could see him working through it. The specific quality of his face when he was assembling information and didn't like where it was going. Then he said, "Okay, she said. He left. She stood in the middle of her living room after the door closed and let the silence of the apartment settle around her. Then she picked up her coffee from the counter, which was cold by now, and stood at the kitchen window and looked down at the street and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of something that was not satisfaction and not relief, but was the feeling of a long-held breath, almost ready to be let out. Marcus found her 2 days later. She was at Carol's building on the 12th floor in the early evening when most of the support staff had left, and the hallway held the particular gray quiet of an office building after business hours. Marcus had come on a pretext, a document requiring Carol's signature, and Carol had already left, and there was Nora by the elevator with her coat over her arm, her phone in her hand. She looked up when she heard his step, and her expression showed no surprise, because she felt none. "I thought you might want to talk," Marcus said. "I'm listening," she said. What he said over the next 4 minutes was delivered in the calm, precise voice of a man who is frightened and has decided that frightened people do not speak in frightened voices. He said her acquisitions would be challenged thoroughly, and she would spend money she didn't have for a result that wouldn't go her way. He said what she was doing was going to hurt Daniel, whom she claimed to have cared about. He said there was a settlement number better than whatever she was going to get at the end of this, and that she was smart enough to know it. He said, last, that he hoped she would be practical rather than let what happened between her and Daniel and turn her into someone who made expensive emotional decisions. He delivered all of this with the confident precision of a man who had delivered difficult messages many times and who understood that confidence is most of the message. She listened to every word. Then she said, "I appreciate you coming to me directly. That actually makes things simpler." He said, "I hope you'll think about what I've said." "I will," she said. "Good night, Marcus." She pressed the elevator button and looked at her phone, and her posture said the conversation was over, and he stood there for a moment with the expression of a man who expected to have been more effective, and then the elevator arrived, and she stepped in, and the doors closed. She did not look at her phone until the lobby. When she did, she opened the audio recorder and pressed stop. 4 minutes, 12 seconds. She sent it to Carol with one line more than enough. 3 days later, Simone Archer sat in her apartment on a Friday evening with a glass of wine she wasn't particularly drinking and a book she wasn't particularly reading. She had been thinking, carefully, without drama, about the conversation in her apartment and about the gala and about the 14 months in general, and she had arrived at a conclusion she recognized. She had been approaching for some time. She was not angry. She was not sad in the way of loss. She was sad in the way of closing a door you know you won't reopen, which is a different sadness, quieter, more final, and oddly clean. She sat with it until she was clear, and then she stopped sitting with it because she was clear. Carol's call came the following morning. Her voice carried the understated satisfaction of a woman who does not permit herself visible enthusiasms, but who has, at this particular moment, earned it the timestamp on the original email. The one Marcus had printed and given Daniel was inconsistent with the creation metadata in the server archive by 14 hours, not seconds, not a system anomaly. 14 hours in the middle of a workday on a device logged under an admin account that Nora had never used, under circumstances that no legitimate IT audit would produce. Nora set the phone down and looked out the window of her home office at the November sky, which was the color of pewter and perfectly still. She felt the particular quality of a thing coming fully into focus, not new information. She had known this for over a year, but the completeness of it now, the readiness, the sense of a container finally full. She said to the window quietly, "Okay, we're ready." Chapter 4. The night he found out Daniel called his IT director on a Monday morning without telling Marcus. This in itself was unusual. Over 7 years, Daniel had developed the habit of looping Marcus in on any infrastructure-level request, not because Marcus needed to know, but because Marcus had built a quiet, systematic awareness of Hargrove Capital's operational layer that Daniel had found more efficient to use than to duplicate. The thought that this awareness was something Marcus had designed to serve his own purposes had not occurred to Daniel until approximately 48 hours after leaving Nora's apartment with 2 instructions he had been turning over ever since. He met with Grace Park, his IT director, at 8 in the morning in a small conference room on the 17th floor with the door closed. Grace was methodical, precise, and had worked at Hargrove Capital for 9 years without ever appearing to form opinions about any of the information she processed, which was one of the reasons Daniel trusted her with what he was about to ask. He told her he needed the original source file for a specific archived email, not a copy, not a print, the actual original with the complete server routing metadata. He gave her the sender address, the approximate date range, the recipient. He said this was sensitive and he would like it handled without flag. She said she would have it by noon. She had it by 10:30. She brought it to him in a sealed envelope, set it on the conference table, and left without comment. He opened it after the door closed and read the routing metadata for the first time. The email was real. Nora had sent it from her account on the date indicated. The content was exactly as he remembered it, but the metadata showed something the printed PDF had been unable to show. The source file had been accessed and modified by a device logged in under a Hargrove Capital admin account in the 5 days prior to Marcus bringing it to Daniel's desk. The access log showed a 14-hour window during which properties in the file's header data, invisible to any casual reader but identifiable by a competent forensic analyst in under an hour, had been altered. Daniel sat with this document for a long time. The conference room was very quiet. 29 floors below, Park Avenue moved through its morning. He then called the photographer. It took 20 minutes on the phone with the event management company that had handled the industry development conference where the photograph had allegedly been taken before he reached Michael Tran, who was based in Hoboken and had been photographing corporate events for 15 years with the pleasant, business-like energy of someone who does a job well without attaching significance to it. Daniel described the photograph and the event and asked whether Tran had any record of a candid shot taken at a private dinner that evening. There was a pause. That dinner was a ticketed industry event, Tran said. Open registration, about 200 people. I photographed the whole evening. Standard contract coverage. Another pause. Who told you it was a private dinner? Daniel said thank you and ended the call. He sat at his desk and did not do anything else for several minutes. He was looking at his screen but not reading it. He was thinking about the word private, Marcus's specific word. The assistant said it came up in a batch and wasn't sure if it was supposed to be private, and about how much weight a single adjective can carry when you are holding a document that says someone doesn't love you and are looking for confirmation rather than contradiction. He thought about the question he had not asked then. He thought about all of them. He called Marcus and asked him to come to his office at 2 o'clock, citing the Meridian Portfolio Review. It was a meeting he had been meaning to have, and it gave him a plausible reason that would not alert Marcus to anything until he was already in the room. Marcus arrived at 2 with his usual ease. He sat across the desk and spoke about the Meridian situation for 4 minutes with the informed, practical fluency that had made him valuable for 7 years. Daniel asked 2 questions that were genuinely about Meridian. Then he slid the routing metadata printout across the desk and said, "This came from the server archive this morning. Help me understand it." Marcus looked at the document. He went very still. His stillness was the specific stillness of a face working very hard at not moving. He looked up. "Where did you get this?" "From Grace, this morning." "The original archive." Daniel's voice was flat in the way it became when the anger was very large and the control over it was very tight. The 2 things in him had always been correlated. That admin account. "Tell me about the admin account." Daniel, "Tell me about the admin account, Marcus." Marcus sat back slightly. He looked at the document and then at Daniel, and something shifted in his face. Not collapse, not apology, but the adjustment of a man who has been found out and is now calculating his next move from a new position. "Okay," he said. "Okay, hear me out. I'm listening. What I did, how I handled this, I know how it looks, but you need to understand the context." His voice was level and deliberate. The bored voice, the creditor voice, the voice designed to project certainty, when certainty is the last thing you actually have. Nora was planning to leave. I knew this. I had seen things, conversations, patterns that told me the marriage was at its end. and I knew that if she initiated the divorce on her terms, the IP situation was going to be complicated in ways that would take this company years to untangle. The patents she co-owned are foundational to our most profitable product line. If she walked out with the leverage to negotiate on her terms, Daniel, she didn't walk out, Daniel said. I asked her to leave because I gave you the tools to do it cleanly. Before she could put herself in a stronger position, you gave me fabricated evidence. I gave you an accelerant. Marcus leaned forward slightly. The marriage was already over. I didn't manufacture what you were feeling or what she was feeling. I made it possible to end it on terms that protected the company, protected you. He held Daniel's eyes. Ask yourself what would have happened if she'd gone to a lawyer first. You know what she would have walked out with. You know what the patent structure looked like. She co-owned those patents, Daniel said, because she contributed to developing them. While I was at conferences and board dinners, she was doing the R&D work that those patents came from. And you saw that contribution as a liability. I saw it as a risk that needed managing. For the company, Daniel said, or for yourself. Marcus was quiet. It was the first time in the conversation he had been quiet, and its quality was different from the controlled pauses. Before, it was the quiet of a man who has run out of working angles. Because you have been running this company for 7 years, Daniel said, and you have done it very well, and those patents are foundational to the most profitable part of our portfolio, and as long as I was married to Nora, that was shared equity that no restructuring could touch. But once we were divorced and she walked away with a settlement that didn't include operational equity, that's not what this was. Then tell me what it was. I told you. Protection. I made a judgment call. Who for? The silence was the specific silence of a man who has arrived at the end of his material. Marcus sat with it for a long moment and then said, very quietly, for the company. I made a judgment call about what the company needed. You made it without telling me, Daniel said. You decided what I needed to know and what I didn't, and you gave me a fabricated document, and I ended my marriage on the basis of that document, and you have spent 2 years watching me live with that, and you have not said one word. He looked at Marcus steadily. You need to leave my office. HR will begin the formal process tomorrow morning. You are not to contact any board member, any investor, or any employee in this company until that process is complete. Marcus stood. He picked up his legal pad with the automatic precision of a man for whom presentation had been armor for a very long time. He looked at Daniel with an expression that contained, finally, something real, not remorse exactly, but the look of someone who understands clearly what they have lost and is not going to give the room the satisfaction of watching them feel it. Then he walked to the door and opened it and left. Daniel sat alone for 15 minutes. Then he picked up his phone and called Nora's number. She didn't answer. He left a voicemail that said, only I know. I'm coming over. She was waiting when he arrived at the Upper West Side Co-op. She opened the door before he knocked, which meant she had heard the elevator, or had been near the door, or had been expecting this in the specific way you expect the completion of something you have been watching build for a long time. The apartment was warm and quiet. She led him to the living room, and they sat, she in the chair across from him, he on the couch, and there was a quality to the space between them that was different from every other space they had occupied together in 2 years. Not comfortable, not warm, but honest, in the way a thing is honest when all the performance has finally burned off. She opened a folder on the coffee table and placed 4 documents in sequence. The forensic email analysis Carol had commissioned 18 months ago, which identified the nature and extent of the alteration with technical specificity, down to the device ID of the admin account used. The photographer, Michael Tran's, signed statement, prepared 2 months prior, attesting to the nature of the event as open registration industry coverage. The audio recording, 4 minutes, 12 seconds, clean and clear, from the hallway outside Carol's building, and a 3-page timeline document showing the share acquisitions, the legal preparations, and the board composition analysis in chronological order. He read everything. She didn't rush him. She sat with her coffee, which she didn't drink, and let him work through it. When he set the last page down, he looked at her. "How long?" he said. 14 months, she said. "I found out 6 months after the divorce was final." Carol had a contact at the forensic firm who ran a preliminary analysis I commissioned independently. It took a few weeks to confirm what the metadata was showing. He was quiet. "Then why didn't you come to me directly when you found out?" She looked at him with a patience that was not unkind. "With what? A preliminary analysis and 2 holding companies? I needed a room to bring this into, Daniel. A room where it couldn't be buried by legal process or by Marcus getting ahead of it first." A pause. "I also needed to know whether you were going to be the person who helped me build that room or the person I built it around. And now I have the room, and you know the truth. And I need one thing." She leaned forward slightly, forearms on her knees, voice direct. "Tomorrow morning, Marcus is going to call an emergency board meeting. He found out this afternoon that I have the proxies to call my own vote, and he's going to try to get ahead of it. I need you in that room. I need your vote, not your apology, not your feelings about any of this. Your vote in that room tomorrow. You'll have it," he said. She looked at him for a moment, and then, quietly, not as accusation, not as bid for sympathy, but as the simple act of setting down something heavy she had been carrying, "Alone I would have stayed. Daniel, if you had asked me, not about the email, not about the photograph, but just asked me, if you had come to me and said, 'I feel like you're somewhere else, I feel like we're slipping, I need to know what's real between us.' If you had asked me anything, I would have stayed." She said it once. She did not repeat it. The weight of it settled into the room the way something heavy settles, without drama, with the specific permanence of a fact. "I know," he said. "I know you know," she said. "Good night, Daniel." He was at the elevator when his phone rang. Simone's name on the screen. He answered it in the hallway, outside Nora's door, and her voice was calm and specific, the voice she used when she had thought something through, completely, and was now simply saying it. "I've been thinking since last week," she said, "and I think we both already know where we are. I don't want things to just fade out. You deserve a real conversation, and so do I." "You're right," he said. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry," she said. "I knew what I was walking into. I thought maybe I was wrong about the thing I couldn't quite reach. I wasn't." A pause, and then, with a warmth that was entirely genuine, "I think you've loved her the whole time, Daniel. I think even you didn't know it until recently. And I think it's time you figured out what to do about that." She said. She wished him well. She said she meant it. She ended the call. He stood in the hallway for a moment. Then he opened a text to Nora and typed 2 words, "I'll be there." He put his phone in his pocket and called the elevator. A minute later, in the apartment, Nora's phone lit up on the coffee table. She looked at the message for a moment. She placed the phone face down and went back to the documents she was reviewing for the morning, and her face did not do anything particular, but her shoulders, if you had been watching very carefully, dropped approximately 1/4 of an inch. Chapter 5. What it cost and what it became a. They arrived separately at the Hargrove Capital offices at 7:45 in the morning, which was earlier than the standard board meeting time and earlier than the board members had been told, which was Marcus's calculation, late enough to catch people off guard, early enough that they couldn't reorganize before morning. His assistant had sent the notice at 11 the previous night. citing an urgent matter regarding a challenge to the company's shareholder structure. Technically accurate. The move of a man playing defense with the full understanding that offense was no longer available to him. The Hargrove Capital Board met on the 32nd floor in a room with east-facing windows that on clear mornings showed the East River as a narrow, dark line at the horizon. This was a clear morning. The city outside was cold and bright and specific, and the room smelled like the coffee service set up in the corner, and the 8 board members present, when Nora walked in, had the slightly compressed energy of people who had been surprised by an early meeting and who were not remotely happy about it. Marcus was at the head of the table, composed, dressed with his usual precision, and afraid in the specific way that very controlled people are afraid, the fear not on his face, but in the exactness with which he occupied his chair, the particular quality of stillness that is not relaxation but its inverse. Nora took a seat on the left side of the table, 2 chairs down from the head. Carol sat beside her. 2 board members, Margaret Osei, a former appellate judge, and Russell Chin, the company's longest-serving independent director, met Nora's eyes briefly as she settled. She had spent the previous 4 months in private conversations with each of them, presenting her findings with the calm specificity of someone asking for nothing beyond the truth and its consequences. They had heard her out. They were here. Daniel arrived at 7:52. He came through the door without looking at Marcus and without looking at Nora, and took a seat at the far end of the table with the focused internal expression of a man who has made a decision and is no longer revisiting it. Marx called the meeting to order. He was good. He had always been good. He presented the shareholder challenge with the confident fluency of someone who had prepared for hours, placing his bet on the possibility that 2/3 of the people in this room would trust his framing over someone else's evidence. He said the acquisition process had circumvented standard disclosure requirements. He said the chain of title on 3 of the acquisitions was legally questionable and had been flagged by outside counsel. He said the board had a fiduciary obligation to pause proceedings until a full review was complete. He spoke for 11 minutes without a visible sign of uncertainty. He was, even now, impressive. Margaret Osei said, "I'd like to hear from Ms. Caldwell." Marcus said, "The purpose of this meeting." "I'm aware of the purpose," Margaret said pleasantly. "Ms. Caldwell." Nora presented the acquisition timeline, the quarterly purchases, the filing dates, the SEC registration, and then, quietly, a legal opinion from an outside securities attorney confirming the acquisitions were properly structured and compliant. She named Marcus's 3 procedural challenges and addressed each in 3 sentences apiece, referencing the statutory requirements and the date of Carol's filed responses. She was precise and unhurried, and the precision was its own argument. This was not improvisation. This had been a long time in preparation. Russell Chin asked 2 questions. She answered them. Margaret Osei asked one. She answered it. Then Marcus said, "What Ms. Caldwell hasn't told the board is the full context of this campaign. She is the ex-wife of this company's founder and CEO. She left this marriage under circumstances she has characterized one way, the actual circumstances of which are considerably more complicated than she is representing." He looked around the table. "The board has an obligation to consider the personal motivation behind this action." "My personal motivations," Nora said, "are not in dispute. I believed I was wronged. Whether I was wronged is a matter of evidence." She looked at Daniel. Daniel looked back at her. Then he looked at the board. "I have something to say," he said. His voice was steady in the manner of someone for whom the decision is already behind them. "I had Grace Park in IT pull the original server archive of an email that was shown to me 2.5 years ago. The forensic analysis of that file is consistent with alteration of the source data by a Hargrove Capital admin account in the 5 days prior to my seeing it. He looked at Marcus. I also spoke directly with the photographer who covered the industry dinner, referenced in a photograph I was shown at the same time. That dinner was a public event, open registration. I was given a different account of its nature. The room held a particular stillness. I take full responsibility for the decisions I made at the time, Daniel continued. I did not ask enough questions. I accepted what I was shown because it was easier than the alternative. He looked at the board, but this board deserves to know that the information underlying this entire dispute originated in a misrepresentation that came from the senior executive level of this company. Marcus's voice came back immediately, and it was, finally, the voice of a man burning the last of his fuel. What Daniel is describing is a preliminary analysis not independently reviewed, the account of a single photographer speaking to an event 3 years ago, and the characterization of a CEO who is clearly not capable of objectivity about this situation. He looked around the table with the urgent, leveled confidence of a man who has nothing left but the performance of confidence. This board is being asked to remove a COO who built the operational infrastructure of this company on the basis of evidence presented by his ex-wife. Think carefully about what you're being asked to do, Nora said. Play it. Carol placed a small speaker on the table and pressed play. Marcus's voice came out clearly, the calm, specific voice from the 12th floor hallway of 12 days ago, telling Nora her acquisitions would be challenged thoroughly, that there was a settlement number better than what she'd get at the end of this, that she should be practical, rather than let what happened between her and Daniel turn her into someone who made expensive emotional decisions. The recording played for 4 minutes and 12 seconds. When it ended, the room held the specific quiet of people who have heard something they cannot unhear. Margaret Osei said, "I'd like to call the vote." Marcus said, "This recording was obtained without my consent and cannot be treated as, this is not a court of law." Russell Chin said, with the flat patience of a man who has sat on boards for 30 years, "We are making a governance decision." The vote took 4 minutes, 6-2, in favor of Marcus Webb's suspension pending formal investigation, effective immediately. Marcus stood. He straightened his jacket with the automatic precision of a man for whom presentation had been armor for most of his adult life. He looked at Daniel, not with anger, not with pleading, but with the flat, final look of someone who understands exactly what they have lost and is not giving the room the satisfaction of watching them absorb it. "You're going to spend the next 3 years untangling what I built," he said. Calm, factual. Then he held Daniel's eyes for one more moment and said the last true thing available to him. "She's licensing your IP to Vance's firm, your own patents to a competitor for 15 years. I hope what you just did in here was worth what it's going to cost you." He looked briefly at Nora. "She already won, Daniel. She just needed you to help her finish it." Security appeared at the door. Marcus walked out without looking back, still precise, still performing certainty until the elevator doors closed behind him and the hallway was quiet. Margaret began to speak about the investigation process. Russell asked Carol a question about the formal timeline. The board moved into aftermath with the practiced efficiency of people who have absorbed institutional shocks before and know that the work doesn't pause for any of them. Nora gathered her documents. She did not look at Daniel across the table. She didn't need to. She was in the hallway outside the conference room, waiting for the elevator when she heard his step. "Nora." She turned. He was standing 5 feet away with his jacket on and the specific look of a man who has just done something hard and is standing in the first minutes of the aftermath, the exhaustion of it, and the cleanness of it, and the particular grief of a thing done right that arrived much too late, he said. The licensing deal. Elliot's firm already signed, she said. Effective this quarter. 15-year term. He absorbed this. Marcus was always going to say that last. Yes, he was quiet for a moment. Were you always going to do it? Yes, she said. Elliot's firm has the infrastructure to develop the technology in ways Hargrove Capital wasn't going to prioritize. It was the right deal for the patents. She paused and said honestly, it was also satisfying to be the one making it. He almost smiled. It was a complicated almost, I know. She looked at him. The hallway was quiet around them, the rest of the floor going about its ordinary business, completely unaware of what had happened in the conference room 30 minutes ago. What you said in there, she said, standing up before you had to. I know what that cost you. It needed to be said. I know it did. She met his eyes. The story you've built your whole professional life, the man who reads situations correctly, who doesn't get played, who makes the right call and can always defend it. That story dies in that room. I know that. Yes, he said. I'm not coming back to the company, Daniel. I know. I didn't do this to come back. I did it because it was real and because it was mine and because she stopped for a moment, holding something she had held for a long time, and then she set it down, because I would have stayed, and I deserved to be the one who got to decide that, not Marcus. He was quiet for what felt like a long time. The elevator arrived. She put her hand on the door. Nora, he said. She looked at him. I spent 2 years being angry at a woman who wasn't, who Marcus told me she was, he said. I made a decision about you without asking you a single question, and then I built 2 years of my life on top of that decision. He stopped. He said, the rest simply, without softening it, I should have asked. She looked at him with the steady, direct gaze of a woman who has said everything she needed to say and is still here anyway, still present, still choosing not to walk away quite yet. Yes, she said, you should have. The elevator held. She held the door. Neither of them moved for a moment that was too long to be accidental and too short to resolve anything. Then she stepped in. She looked at him once more, not with love, not with anger, with the clear and accurate gaze of someone seeing a person exactly as they are, and the doors closed. 3 weeks later, Caldwell Tech Ventures held its first public industry event in a converted warehouse space in Soho that had been rented for the evening, and which Nora had furnished with the specific, unpretentious warmth of someone who knows what she's doing and doesn't need it announced. Good lighting, actual food from a catering team hired for quality rather than reputation. A room full of people who were in the early stages of paying attention to what she was building, which was exactly the stage she had wanted them in when she planned this evening 6 months ago. She moved through the room the way she always moved through rooms, without haste, with genuine attention, arriving at each conversation as if it were the only one she intended to have. She talked to developers about the patent applications filed in the previous quarter, and to 2 potential partners about the infrastructure build-out, and to a journalist from a trade publication who had clearly done her research and whose questions were specific enough to be worth answering carefully. The evening was going well. The evening was going exactly as she had planned, which was the most satisfying thing she knew how to feel. Daniel arrived on time, which she noticed. He came alone, which she also noticed, and which she told herself meant nothing specific except that the gala felt very long ago, which it was. He found her an hour into the event, near a cluster of developers by the east wall, and stood at the edge of the group for a moment before she saw him and moved toward him. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Thank you for the invitation," he said. They talked about the Marcus investigation, which had entered its second week and was producing, with the grinding regularity of proper institutional process, exactly the documentation that 18 months of patience had built a case to receive. They talked about the patent applications and the technology's direction, and Daniel followed it with the genuine attention he had for things that were well conceived, asking 2 questions that were specific and good. They talked briefly about Elliot. She answered one question about the licensing structure in technical terms that made clear she understood it better than anyone else in the room, which didn't surprise him. At some point, the event had settled into its later, quieter register, and they had drifted toward the south wall, where a run of tall windows looked out at the city, doing what the city does at night, a kind of organized radiance, lit and moving and entirely indifferent. The party went on warmly behind them. Ahead of them, through the glass, Manhattan arranged itself in its usual magnificent indifference. He looked out at the city for a moment and then said, "What would you have done differently?" It was not entirely a question. She heard the full weight of what he was asking, which was not just professional and not just strategic, but the whole of it: the marriage, the silence, the choice to build in secret rather than to fight, the specific cost of 18 months of patience, the texture of carrying it alone. She thought about it honestly. "I would have told you what was happening to me," she said, "instead of going quiet and hoping you'd see it." She looked at the city outside the glass. "When I felt you pulling back, I thought if I just held still, you'd find your way back. I thought if I waited long enough, you would notice, and I was too proud to ask." She paused. "That's not the same as not caring, but from the outside it looked the same, and I let it." He was quiet for a moment. "I would have asked," he said, instead of assumed. He kept his eyes on the city. "I decided what your silence meant. It was easier than sitting with not knowing, and Marcus gave me a document that confirmed what I had already, privately, decided to believe, and I let myself be confirmed." A pause. "I should have been harder to convince," she said. "Yes," he said, "I know." The silence that followed was long and not uncomfortable, which was something neither of them had expected to find on the other side of everything they had just come through. Outside, the city continued its perpetual ordinary business, lit and indifferent and enormous. Around them, the event moved warmly through its last hour. She turned toward him slightly, not a dramatic turn, not a turn of declaration, just the slight, honest orientation of someone who has, after a very long effort at maintaining a careful distance, stopped maintaining it. It was the smallest possible movement, less than an inch. He saw it. He didn't name it. He stayed where he was and let it be what it was: not a resolution, not a return, but something quieter and more tentative and real, the beginning of a beginning, in a room full of people who were paying attention to the future she was building, while the two of them stood at a window in the South Manhattan evening, and were, for the first time, simply honest with each other about what they had both lost and what they had both done and who they actually were. She didn't say anything else, neither did he. The city moved below them. The party went on around them, warm and occupied, and full of the particular energy of something new starting, and they stood there together, in the quiet particular to 2 people who have stopped pretending to be strangers, watching the lit water at the edge of the island do what it had always done, indifferent and beautiful and entirely unchanged.